Good afternoon. My name is Andy Drennan. I'm FPSA Senior Vice President of Membership, and it is my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today's webinar, Mr. Kelly Riggs. Kelly is an author, speaker, and business performance coach for executives and companies throughout North America. He has worked with companies in a wide variety of industries, ranging from $3 million in sales revenue to Fortune 500 companies. Kelly's background as a coach and an owner or partner in 4 different business ventures has helped him to create a wildly successful track record. His owners dramatically improve their performance. Widely recognized as a dynamic thought leader and successful performance coach in the area of sales, management leadership, and strategic planning, Kelly is a former sales executive and 2-time National Salesperson of the Year with well over 2 decades of executive management and training experience. Kelly has written 3 books: One-on-One Management, What Every Great Manager Knows That You Don't, Quit Whining and Start Selling, a step-by-step guide to a Hall of Fame career in sales, and his 3rd book, written with his son, Robbie Riggs, titled Counter Mentor Leadership, How to Unlock the Potential of the 4-Generation Workplace. On one more note, Kelly has also been our keynote speaker the past 2 FPSA sales conferences and has consistently been ranked as our top speaker. So we're very grateful to have him here today. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kelly for today's presentation.
All right, thank you very much. And we'll make our way over to, show this window. Yes, that's what we want to do. And let me get that up, and that'll make a difference. Welcome, everybody. Great to have you. And Andy, thank you for the introduction. And I have very fond memories of the FPSA sales conferences, and hopefully at some point in time life will get back to normal and maybe we'll get to do that again. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? You know, it's really interesting coming out of COVID 2020. Of course, it's still a part of our lives, but it's dramatically different than it was March the 1st. This is how it impacted me. For 15 years, I was an executive platinum flyer with American Airlines, meaning I was on well over 100 flights a year, over 100,000 miles a year, sometimes substantially so. And since March the 1st of 2020, I have not been on an airplane for business purposes, not at all. So I'm tracking into 1 year with no business flights. So the world has shifted dramatically, not only for me, but for I'm sure all of you as well. And as we began thinking about 2020 towards the end in December, and thinking about that time period and all of the fallout of COVID and everything related to it, along with every other thing that always happens is, for business leaders, everything else we have to deal with, we began to think about some very critical questions that we need to ask ourselves. And as I mentioned in the description for this particular webinar, this is born out of the kind of work that I do on an everyday basis. And I ask perhaps very different kinds of questions. There's a lot that goes on in running a business. You know that as well as I do. I've owned a number of businesses and understand what it takes to have a payroll and to work in operations and to coordinate everything and deal with customers and pay insurance and risk and every other thing in the world, and people, not to mention people. There's just an awful lot to running a business, and that's kind of the things that I want to talk about. I mean, leadership is hard, without any objections whatsoever, without any equivocations or qualifications. Leadership is hard, and it's hard mostly because of people. If you didn't have to deal with employees and customers, it might be a lot easier. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. So leaders tend to get caught up in the daily grind, to get caught up in the tactical, the technical, the trivial things, and many times they're not focused on leadership responsibilities and some of the more critical issues. And on top of that, we don't always change easily. We don't change well. And adaptability in business is a critical component of success. And I think we're seeing that even more so when we get thrown this giant curveball called a pandemic. And so what I want to do is encourage you to get involved on the chat. And I'm going to be looking over to the side here and looking at the chat panel, and because I want to encourage you to get involved. So find that chat panel on GoToWebinar. And the first question I want to ask you, and this is not part of the 9 questions, but some introductory questions. Let me ask you first this. What's the hardest part of running your business? Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. Throw something in the chat box, because there's a point not only to the question, but there also is good feedback to hear from business leaders what they're dealing with. So when you think about running your business, if you own it, or if you're the GM or the CEO, or maybe it's your department, maybe it's your sales team, whatever the case may be, what's the hardest part of running your business? And I'm going to give you a second to type those in, think about it, type it in, and put it into the chat box, because I think one of the challenges that we really deal with in the leadership grind is we get hyper focused on technical and tactical, and many times those big picture items never really come to us. And I want to make sure I've got this up. So somebody throw something on the chat for me, so I know that that I'm getting your answers. Andy, if you would, you might even throw something on there and say hello or something on the chat box. But I want to interact with you a little bit before we get started, because I want to make a couple of points that relate to this. Oftentimes we get to the new year and we start thinking about the old year, and we think about, things we need to do different. It's a good dividing line, isn't it? That year's over. Well, man, COVID in 2020 was that in spades. And yeah, thank you for Andy jumping in there. And then he says managing the high degree of uncertainty. And I think that's a big deal, okay? When you think about running your business, think about the components of your business and tell me what's the hardest part of doing that. For Andy, it's the uncertainty. But when you get hyper focused on the day-to-day activities, when you get focused on the firefighting aspects of getting things done, it becomes very, very difficult. Since we got one in the question box, let me jump it over there. A positive team environment. John, thank you for that. Appreciate that very much. My point is that typically when you think about running your business and then you think about the biggest challenge in reaching your goals, they're big picture things, they're strategic things, but every day for you is typically more of a tactical exercise. Stay with me here. Most leaders, we're going to talk about this in the leadership piece, but most leaders are so busy dealing with the everyday aspects of what gets thrown at them, they oftentimes don't have time to deal with some of the more significant parts of that. Managing organizational initiatives while handling the new daily priorities that come our way without notice. Absolutely right. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. Unpredictability is a tough piece of running the business, no question. Handling customer demands with a reduced staff. I would have been shocked if I didn't get that one. That one's very, very common in today's parlance. Since the latter part of Q4 of 2020 into Q1 of this year, we're hearing that a lot. We've got more customer demands because people want more, need more, and yet in many instances we're dealing with reduced staff. But when you think about the everyday issues you deal with, typically, not always, but typically leaders are dealing with tactical stuff. They're firefighting. They're putting on their fire suits and they're solving problems and dealing with day-to-day things. And many times those things are related directly to COVID, right? I mean, we've got technicians that are out because of COVID. We've got to rearrange meetings because of COVID. It's a lot of those tactical issues that we get into. And I think those are the problems that we run into on a daily basis, even without COVID. But now COVID makes it a problem. Keeping the team motivated, yeah, no doubt about that. Penetration of non-traditional markets while increasing your core business, right? Has COVID not become like the biggest challenge for you? Not COVID per se, but in 2021, if you're going to reach your revenue objectives, and hopefully you haven't had to write down your objectives dramatically, but if you're going to do that, then the challenge is how do we deal with the fallout of COVID? And so there's some really significant questions that I want to ask you. And look, this is going to be 45, 50 minutes of thinking exercise. And then I'm going to turn it over to you for some Q&A. We'll pop back out of the slides and I'll answer any direct questions. But I'm going to be very candid and I'm going to ask you some tough questions, and they may or may not be what you're expecting or what you're looking for. But in the work that I do, they're the kinds of things that you absolutely have to look at. I am fortunate in that my consulting work, I actually get to work in 3 different areas. Now, like a Venn diagram, they all overlap and there's a point where they all come together in the middle. But I deal with strategic planning a lot. I deal with leadership development, executive team development a lot. and I train a lot of sales people and sales teams, right? So it gives me sort of a unique perspective because I'm not just a strategic planner, not just a leadership guy, not just a sales trainer. I get to see all of those things inside of a lot of companies, okay? These are not going to be fluff questions. And for you to really get any impact out of them, you're really going to have to think about them seriously. So let's start with the first one inside of strategic planning. Simple question. Do you currently have a detailed plan for addressing the critical issues that are impacting your company? I'm not talking about what's going on in your head. I'm not talking about some of the conversations you've had with maybe other parts of your executive leadership team. I'm talking about, do you have a plan? Do you understand exactly where you are, what your current situation is? Do you know exactly what big mountains you have to climb in order to achieve those objectives? Have you got it all the way down into organic, daily grind action plans with specifics? And then, we'll talk about timelines in just a moment, but is it on a timeline? For many years, I've done a presentation called Why Your Strategic Plan is Doomed to Fail. It doesn't make me a lot of friends, right? What kind of harsh title is that? Well, the number one reason it's doomed to fail is most people don't have one. That's reality. Most companies don't have a detailed strategic plan. Number two, it's not strategic at all. It comes as a result of some ideas that we've thrown together. We've had our brainstorming sessions, and we've taken some tactics and thrown them on paper and said we're going to do that. Another reason they fail is because we spend 3 days coming up with all kinds of good ideas, but we never actually create any accountability to it. We don't execute on it. You know why? Here's the reality. We got to go back to work on Monday, and we all have jobs to do, and it makes it very difficult if you don't have a methodology for actually following up. But it's the critical issues that have to get identified and dealt with, the ones that are really standing in your way. Worked with an engineering company, for example, started doing strategic planning with them about 7 years ago. And when we first started, it was very difficult. Every principal in the group wanted to be in the strategic planning meeting, 20 plus. That's a train wreck. All right, so we had all these people in the room. They all have an opinion, but they all have different levels of commitment to execution. And really, to pull off the strategic plan, you need the right people in the room, and then you need to build the execution plan. Or all we've done is talk for a while. But in this particular case, these people were very serious about putting together a plan to solve very critical issues, things like profitability and non-profitable partners and unprofitable customers and resource allocation and all these kinds of things. And we began about 7 years doing that. I'm still doing strategic planning with them today, and we've watched as their project number and their revenue number has literally turned like a hockey stick. Because of me? No, of course not. It's because they decided to get serious about a plan that was detailed to identify, attack, and resolve very specific issues. And so they grew their profits and their profitability. As an example, I worked with another association, like FPSA is an organization. I worked with that group, and we began doing their strategic planning. And there were some very big detailed issues on the table because we did focus groups with members, and we began to get a sense of the challenges, the issues, the problems. Fast forward, come into the strategic planning meeting, and it's like we're just going to rearrange the books on the bookshelf. And I'm like, hang on a second. What about these issues? Well, yeah, those are issues, but we really can't do anything with those. We'll upset the apple cart. We'll create all kinds of problems. I'm like, excuse me? I thought that was the point. And to his great credit, the executive director, the president of the association stood up and said, you know what? We've been doing strategic planning for several years now, and we never really get anything significant done. Oh, don't get me wrong. We've made progress. We've made a few changes. We've improved some things, but we've got some systemic issues on the table that we need to fix. Now's the time, right? But it takes the right leader at the front end to do that. And if you don't have a detailed plan for those issues that's well communicated, well understood, and everybody knows their role, then here's the reality. COVID's going to kick your butt. Maybe not completely. Listen, as leaders, I know the strength of willpower you have. I know you can drag that organization into success, kicking and screaming many times, But look, that's no way to run the show, right? That's no way to lead your team. Strategic plans are created because everybody needs to know what's going on and everybody needs to be bought into it, right? And the strategic plan that's not well organized, well constructed, and doesn't have accountability in place is a problem. And that's question number 2. Do you have accountability designed into your plan? Of course, if the answer to question 1 was no, then the answer to question 2 is probably no as well. But do you have metrics and milestones for your strategic planning initiatives? Do you have consistent review? With the engineering company I work with, I personally meet with them and have for years, every other month, once a quarter, sometimes once every 2 months. And I actually chair the meeting and everybody reports to me, not because I'm important, because they want the outside facilitator to create the accountability. Look, we can't go in and sit down with 8 other people, with our peers, and show up and say, yeah, I really didn't get around to it. Or use the 4 most dangerous words in your vocabulary. I don't have time. I can't see you, but show of hands. How many of you have ever said that about something important? I know I should do that, but I don't have time. Look, that's the reality many times inside of leadership, is we're so immersed in the tactical, and we're going to talk about that again when we talk about the leadership questions, that we're not doing some of the critical things, right? But if you don't have consistent review, minimum monthly, if you don't have your plan out on a timeline, if you're not reviewing it consistently and making course corrections and evaluating your progress, then what's your plan worth? I mean, it really creates a problem, which leads me to question number 3, and that is, are all of your people rowing in the same direction? This is a slide that we use a lot when we talk about leadership, but I'm now going to apply it in terms of the strategic plan, because the strategic plan is designed to create clarity, right? Strategic plan, not your day-to-day operational plan. That's different. I mean, you're running the business, and your operational plan is the day-to-day activities it takes to serve your customers, get the products out the door, deal with issues, people management, the whole thing. But there are strategic issues that we have to address inside of that plan in order to make changes. COVID has made that so vividly clear to people that many of my clients wonder, why did we never have a strategic plan before? How are we going to deal with this while we're dealing with our operational plan, which has enough problems of its own, does it not? I mean, it's a struggle. Here's the question for your team. In terms of, are we all rowing in the same direction? What are we fighting for? I borrowed that question from my friend David Burkus, who lives here in Tulsa, where I live. And he's a former professor at Oral Roberts University, written a number of books, millions of views in his TED Talks. David Burkus, B-U-R-K-U-S, just wrote a book about remote teams, and we interviewed him for our podcast, which will air here in a few weeks. But we talk about motivating the team, and it's just that much harder when you talk about remote teams, right? What are we fighting for? I mean, it's so easy to get isolated off, work from home, the new standard hashtag WFH, working from home. But if people believe in something and they believe in a common objective, what Frank Larson and a guy by the name of LaFasto, I think Carl LaFasto, they wrote a book in 1989 called Teamwork: What Must Go Right, What Can Go Wrong. Little known book. Stumbled across this several years ago. And in studying high performance teams, one of the things they said that marks every single high performance team they studied was what they called a, quote, clear and elevating goal. And they went on to say, in fact, in all the instances where we saw team failure, in one way or another, it related to that goal, that objective. You got to get your people all rowing in the same direction at the same time. Patrick Lencioni used that line in the first chapter of a book he wrote called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. How do we get everyone rowing in the same direction? And if we could get everyone rowing in the same direction at the same time, we could dominate any industry. But it doesn't happen unless we're all single-minded about what we're doing each day in furtherance of the strategic plan. You must train your people, you must create clear expectations, and they must understand that vision, that clear and elevating goal. That's just 3 questions for strategic planning, 3 of the 9 that we have overall. But these are 3 compelling questions. And I will tell you, frankly, I lose a lot of people at question 1. Do you have a strategic plan? No. Okay, I'll bite. Why not? Oh, they don't work. Really? Can you imagine your favorite sports team going into a game without a plan? You know, you get in a huddle and the quarterback says, all right, fellas, what do you want to do? Like, excuse me? Yeah, I mean, we didn't practice this week and we didn't create a game plan for this team. And what do you guys think? Come on, it's ludicrous, right? But it happens in business all the time. Let's talk about the sales side. The sales side is a real challenge because I want to share with you a problem. Okay, here's the problem. About 12 million plus, 12.2 million people in the workforce are in sales, roughly 1 in 8 employees. And according to work done by a company called the Objective Management Group, who have assessed over 1 million salespeople, they found this. Based on those assessments, about 7% of salespeople are the elites of selling. 7%. They went on to say, now another 16% could do okay, they just need training. They could do far better. So roughly 1 in 4, I mean 23%, let's call it 1 in 4 salespeople are either really great at the top 7% or they're okay, but they could do a lot better. But the bottom 3 out of 4, they're failing. In fact, according to Objective Management Group, their words, not mine, the bottom 1 out of 4, 25%, are hopeless. I'm sorry, I have to laugh. Is there another part of your organization where you would be willing to accept 3 out of 4 failure? If payroll went out right 1 out of 4 weeks or 1 out of 4 times, if the marketing group got it right, yeah, 1 out of 4. If we delivered successfully only 25%, I mean, it's crazy. But in sales, we tend to accept it, and that's a problem, right? And here's what happens. Many times you have a sales team, a sales department. Let's say you've got 10 salespeople, and and I know that the bottom 3, 4, maybe 5 salespeople are what is getting us across the finish line. We hit our revenue objective last year, maybe not 2020 because of COVID, but generally speaking. But I've got at least half my sales team, and according to the data, more than half that are struggling. They're not getting there, and maybe 2 out of 10 are really just not very good at all. You know it, I know it. If I ask you, you go, yeah, I got a couple of guys I know I need to do something with. What are we doing? Right? That's the problem, because if you achieve the goal as a group, but you've got a number of salespeople who are underperformers, you can easily overlook them or not address them because, hey, after all, come on, Kelly, we hit the number. But is that good enough? And many times you don't even hit the number. That's the worst case scenario. The challenge many times is that when we look at sales, we don't look at it like this. In fact, this is business, much less sales. Sales, business is a competition. All right. And it's in our best interest to learn to compete. I mean, to compete. Listen, somebody wins, somebody loses. Your company gets a deal, that other company, they lost. They're not cashing a check for second place, I promise you. And neither are you when you lose. Right? Success in the sales world is everything about the habits and the choices that you make. We talk about the name of my company is the Business Locker Room. I named it that because business is like sports. It's a competition. And when you talk about sports, you talk about business, there's 4 ways to play the game. You can do what we used to do back when I was younger. We'd get together and we'd play basketball a couple times a week to stay in shape, and we just showed up and played. Now, when we were on the court, we were playing as hard as we could, but most of us are not real basketball players, and we're certainly not practicing every day, and we're not being evaluated. We're just showing up to play because that's what we do. You can play that way. Sadly, that's the way most companies are. They just show up and play. Now, you can play to win, which is what I advocate, or you can play to win at all costs, which is number 3. Not just play to win, but play to win at all costs. Yeah, I don't recommend that one. Or you can do what a lot of our favorite sports teams do, unfortunately, towards the end of the game. You can play not to lose. You know what happens when you play not to lose, right? Most of the time you wind up on the losing end of things. Look, there's only one way to be really successful in selling, and that's to play to win. and that everything we're about is about getting better and improving, because many times the difference between first and second place is pretty thin. In fact, many times it's razor thin. So let's talk about 3 questions I think you need to ask. I'm going to ask you as business leaders, number 1, are you confident in your sales team's ability? No, not just one of them, all of them. Are you really confident? Do you commonly from your sales leaders get excuses? You know, if it's not COVID, it's the economy, or it's the marketing group, or customer service is killing us. Look, as salespeople, we get paid to produce regardless of circumstances. I'm not saying circumstances aren't real, that they don't exist, and that they don't seriously tick me off, because I spent a lot of time in the field as a sales guy. And I know that everything from operations to finance to customer service to a dozen other departments can really throw a monkey wrench in there. But does that mean I should just have an excuse for my failure? Write this down for me. Victims make terrible salespeople. Yeah, they do. Because here's what happens. If you have a convenient excuse, like COVID, like the economy, like anything, it keeps you from looking at the things that can actually be changed. And a lot of the systemic problems are the problems that we need to be looking at. Let me give you just one example. Systemic issue. You're not confident in your sales team's ability. How long does it take to get one of your salespeople from day one up to a level of competence that they can go out and successfully manage a territory or a group of accounts and make presentations and close deals, get orders, and implement them into your company? Now, I know sometimes you're starting from ground zero because you get a brand new salesperson with no experience. A lot of times you're trying to hire experienced salespeople. So for the sake of argument, let's start with somebody who understands the industry and is coming in with a knowledge, basically of the concepts of our products. How long to teach them your systems, your processes, to develop their selling skills, to learn, and to master the language of the industry and all those things. Be a reasonable number, 3, 4, 5 months, 60 days. But do you have a path to that success? And do you have an expectation for it? And do you have somebody coaching them up to that point with the expectation that, hey, at that time frame, we expect you to be competent in doing your job well? I know for a lot of companies, 60 days is very aggressive, very aggressive. But let's take somebody who's got to learn your products. Now, how much time do you have to tack on? How about to learn your industry, the applications and best practices, and understand what the people they're calling on, what their businesses actually do, and what they need to understand to be really successful as a salesperson? That's just one thing. That's just one thing. Most salespeople are not effective. And remember, 3 out of 4 are not effective because we're flat out not training them effectively. No, we're not preparing them effectively. I had a conversation with a client today, and we were talking about sales training. It's a new client, just starting. In fact, they agreed today to go forward. All right, and I've told them I'm not a fan of sales training. They're like, what? Like, no, not because I don't believe in it. I don't believe in the way we do it, because systemically, the reason so few people are great because we don't do it right. Most sales training is one-off. It's at the annual sales meeting, or it's a couple of, we bring in a guy like me and do a half day or a full day seminar and all that. But listen, you don't get great just by getting introduced to the material. The particular client I'm talking to today, talking about golf, you just don't go to the golf pro and get a couple of lessons and suddenly you're shooting par. It doesn't work that way. Right? There's a lot of things that have to go on. Are you confident in your sales team's abilities? If not, it's a systemic problem. It's not as easy as hiring a born salesperson. It's just not. And that leads me to question number 2. Do you think your sales manager is effective? Might have stepped on your toe right there, because that might be you as the leader of the company, the owner, the manager, executive. You might actually be the sales manager. Might be harder for you to figure out if you're effective. Effective sales managers are even more rare than effective salespeople, because typically, who do we take and make the sales leader, the sales manager? We take our best salesperson and say, you're the man, you're crushing it. Let's make you the sales manager. But many times those sales leaders make terrible sales leaders. They don't make great sales managers, right? The people who are great in sales, because they're completely different skill sets. I mean, they're just different. I mean, being a great leader means you got to understand the selling part, and being good at it certainly helps, because when your people need competency help, you can do that. But there's much more to leading than simply managing reports and budgets and CRM and ensuring that we've got the annual meeting schedule. All right, effective sales management is about coaching and training and development and inspiration and working with people and growing their skills and teaching them how to become better as salespeople and sales planners and teaching a process, and on and on and on it goes. And this kind of works into that systemic training problem, because most training is not done well because it's focused on one thing: product. You know, we teach them everything about our product, and what are you saying about it? It's the best, it's the greatest, we do it better than anybody in the industry. We send out salespeople to just simply mimic what they've heard. Here's all the features of the product. Let me give you a big feature dump. Let me just vomit all over you and tell you how great we are, and then say, you know, are you interested? Now, look, I'm way down on one far end of the spectrum, and I'm exaggerating, or not exaggerating, but I'm going to the far end to demonstrate. But where are you on the spectrum between that, not that good, to, yeah, we're really spectacular? Most people, most companies struggle to get above, 50% or 60. And it's because we're just not looking at the bigger picture, the organizational structure and the systemic side of things. Training up a sales manager to be highly effective, in my view, and I've owned companies and I've served as a sales manager and a sales executive. I've been all over the board organizationally. I think that sales manager, the most important people in the building. Second, maybe only to your CEO. Look, I'm not minimizing the role of this chief financial officer or the customer service. I'm not. I'm just saying we got to understand how important they are. And then I'm gonna turn to a third question that's systemic, but it's not a question I would have asked 12 months ago. And it's this: have you effectively adapted to the virtual sales environment? It's not as easy as it sounds. It's not like, hey, you know what? You just turn on the computer and connect to Teams or Zoom or go to meeting or go to webinar or whatever. It's not just that. There's a whole lot of things that are involved there. And it takes a lot to adapt to the environment and to learn how to set up, first off, how to just be on camera, how to interact with the camera. Because see, you know what I'm doing right now? I'm looking at you, but really, right here in my office, I'm just looking at my camera. That's a little bit unnerving, right? I'm not talking to a person. And not only that, if you're not very good as a salesperson in person, what makes you think you're going to be very good on camera, on Zoom, or on the telephone, where I don't even get visual cues? If your people haven't adapted to the virtual sales environment, this has got to be priority number one. You got to do something about it, right? It's important. If you think maybe I'm on the wrong track, just go sit down with one of your salespeople while they're doing a Zoom call and tell me what you think. I mean, you probably have some people who are doing it well, because you've got some self-driven people out there who are going to figure it out in a hurry. But remember, I want to know, do you have confidence in your entire sales team? All right, so let's transition. That's 6 of the 9 questions. Let's talk about leadership for a minute, because this is where the rubber meets the road. Because I can tell you unequivocally that your company goes as you go. Your company reflects you. As a lot of people have said, everything is about leadership. And if you've got an underperforming team, it's not your team's fault. It's not. It's your fault. Well, assuming I'm talking to the leaders, right? It's the leader's fault. I mean, if you don't have a plan and don't have clarity, really hard to blame it on your people when they're not performing at the level you'd like. If you're not training, developing your salespeople, your sales team, and you don't have a very clear sales plan, really easy to blame your salespeople, but that's more about you, right? And at an even more basic level, look, who hires your people? You do. Who trains them? You do. Who's responsible for leading them, for creating the culture and the clarity that they need and the communication that you provide? Who does all that? You do. So when your team's failing, and whose fault again? Look, this doesn't make me the most popular guy around. It's just easier to blame people when they fail. Look, I'm not suggesting your people don't fail. Of course they do. Man, I've failed plenty as an employee. I failed a whole lot more as a leader, but I understand that. But one of the things that I really like, and if you haven't read the book, I highly suggest you get it, Extreme Ownership. Many of you, I assume, probably heard of it, seen it, or even read it. Maybe even used it in some of your work in your office. But Jocko Willink and Leif Babin are guys that I've met. My two sons and I went and spent 3 days with their team, their Navy SEAL team, and were involved in one of their musters. And one of the more productive things I've ever done. And they're pretty clear about it. They say, look, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. Leadership drives everything. And the thing I took away from Jocko's book and from that time with them is this: when you're willing to take responsibility for everything, it forces you to think about things at a level that you wouldn't if you could just say, well, that was marketing's fault. Well, yeah, but could I have done anything differently? Could I have resourced them better, budgeted them better, given them more insight, more capabilities? Could we have had meetings where we brought in outside experts? I have no idea, but it's up to me to ensure that each of my departments and my leaders are succeeding. And if you lead a department, it's up to you to make sure your people are succeeding. Now you might think, well, no, wait a minute. You're telling me to be a micromanager. Oh, no. No, not at all. In fact, quite the opposite. But what I am asking you to do is to take responsibility for your team's failures. And I'm asking you to give them all of the kudos and the encouragement and recognition for their successes, because that's what great leaders do. Right? This thing, leadership, it's hard. It's super hard, but it is the difference. Listen to me. Leadership is the difference between average and extraordinary. When you go back to the book Good to Great, Jim Collins, the uber successful landmark study that he did, okay? What's the critical aspect of great companies? Level 5 leadership. Without it, it doesn't happen. So 3 questions for you. Number 1, are you more of a firefighter than you are a leader? Most leaders are firefighters. In fact, if we're going to be honest, we're really good at it. No, we are. I mean, we're really good at it because we've been making decisions, solving problems, and creating results for a very long time. It got noticed and it got us promoted. And so we move up into layers of leadership and we think, what got me promoted is my ability to make decisions and solve problems. And really, I got promoted because I do it better than most, if not everyone. So I'm saddling up, man. I'm putting on the uniform and I've got my fire hose and I'm ready to go to work. And all day long, I solve problems and I make decisions. Sound like you? You know what the problem is with that? Is it's not leadership. No, it's not. In fact, you're doing what your people should be doing. You're just doing it for them. A lot of your employees would call that micromanagement, or they would call it stifling. There's a real fear involved in being a leader. I remember the first time I was made a sales manager. I was a district manager, so I still managed a smaller territory, and I had 3 salespeople that worked for me. I was responsible for their results, right? I was their manager. I was their boss. And I remember every time one of them lost a sale or didn't hit their number or made a mistake, man, I'm like, wow, they're going to look at me and think I'm terrible. I'm a terrible manager. It's all about me. Instead, I should have been hyper-focused on them. And I quickly made that transition because I had a good teacher. But I made the transition to being a sales manager is about them. Leadership is another people exercise. It's about taking care of their needs and all that, and including growing their competency, which builds confidence, and giving them more autonomy, which gives them the ability to make more decisions. I used to tell them, look, you make a decision in the field, I'm going to support you 100%, no matter what. but you better be doggone sure that's a good decision that lines up with our values and the kind of people we are and the way we do things. Because if you get out there and start promising things like giving away product and freebies and all that, I have to back you up. You better have great reasons for it, and you better be able to justify it. In other words, I just didn't give them the keys to the kingdom and say, go do whatever because Rick says, well, I ought to give you autonomy. No, no, no. No, you train them inside of a set of boundaries that says, here's what you can do on your own. Knock yourself out. In our leadership training, we call that a freedom box. Hey, you know what? For brand new people, that's a really small box. But as people grow in their competency and their maturity and their ability to deliver results, the box gets bigger, right? You don't pay people to work hard. You pay people to produce results. And if those results are only created when you do them, then you're overpaying your people because you can do it. In fact, you're not a leader at all. You're a self-limiting team of one. You just have some assistants helping you out. You'll never multiply your effectiveness. I talked about the 4 most dangerous words in your leadership vocabulary. I don't have time. That is the defining mantra of a firefighter. Look, I'd like to help you, but I don't have time. I got problems to solve. I got people to fix. You know, I got to do it. It's all about me. The sad part is it feels good at the end of the day because you have done a lot of good things. You've solved a lot of problems and all that, but you're not empowering your people. I know we hate that word. I'm not even a fan of that word, but to communicate, we're not creating people who can use their talents in service to the company. I've got to go help them. And you will never get off that hamster wheel, not ever, until you change the way you invest your time. Just won't happen. If you're more of a firefighter than a leader, that's a huge clue that some things need to change with you and your team systemically. Question number 2. Is accountability an issue in your company? I'd be surprised if it isn't, but if it's not, man, congratulations. I'd be surprised if it's not, because I've been consulting with companies for 15 years now, and I can count on one hand the number that didn't aggressively say, oh yeah, it's a problem. I mean, do you have people with performance issues that aren't addressed? Do you have people underperforming and you know, maybe it's not performance results, maybe it's their behavior, maybe it's their attitude, maybe it's the way they deal with other people inside the organization. If accountability is an issue, your people aren't the problem, you are. Remember, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate, right? And so creating accountability is a process. It's not something you demand, it's a process. And you set very clear expectations for those results, which have 3 components that you have to outline. You review them consistently, just like we did with strategic planning. And when there is a performance issue, you deal with it. Why don't people deal with performance issues? You know, I'm listening to you talk. Typically, it's because it's uncomfortable. We don't like conflict. You know, I've had people say, well, you know, this guy's not that great, but he might be better than the next person I bring in. I mean, what a crazy way to run a business. Imagine what it must be like for that person, because people know how you think about them. I mean, they know exactly what your thoughts are. They can tell by the way you treat them, the way you talk to them, and the way you deal with people inside of your culture. They know. So if accountability is an issue, I got great news for you. You can fix it, but we start with you, the leader, and teaching you how to fix it. But if accountability is an issue, you know and I know performance is a problem. And if accountability is an issue and you ignore it, you'll never achieve the level of performance you're capable of. And in this post-COVID, post-2020 COVID environment, you can't afford it. You just can't. It's already hard enough. You've got to have people firing on all cylinders. And if accountability is an issue, it's got to be something that you take care of. Well, that leads me into the last question, which is this. How would you describe your culture? In fact, let's jump back on the chat box, shall we? In the question piece there, I'd like to ask you to describe your culture. Just use a couple of words to describe your culture. What is the culture like in your company? How would you describe the culture in your company? All right, I'm going to wait for you. You put it in that question piece, and I've moved the chat box over here, so I'm looking at you. But take a moment and just use a couple of words, especially based on the conversations we're having. How would you characterize your culture? Okay, and it takes a little bit of a moment here. While you're doing that, while you're thinking about it, I'm going to talk in your ear. For 10 years, the Columbia Business School researched culture. They polled 1,300 CEOs and CFOs about the impact of culture. 92% indicated their belief that the quality of the company's culture was tied directly to their financial success. By the way, that's pretty good intuition because all the research supports that. The data tells us that your culture is a critical part of your company's success. I mean, like a cornerstone foundation piece, all right? More than half said that culture is one of the top 3 drivers of value inside their company. Our culture is one of the top 3 things that drive value for our customers. But then when we get to the payoff pitch, we find out this: only 16%, 1 in 6 corporate leaders suggested that their culture was where it needed to be or that they were actively addressing it. Now that makes absolutely 0 sense to me, doesn't it you? You know culture is important. I think it's critically important. I don't show any questions yet, so I don't know if we're having trouble getting in or if you're just hesitant to write things down that talk about your culture. But I want you to think about it because your culture is everything. And the way people do things inside of your culture is everything. So what is culture exactly? What is it? It's the commonly accepted behaviors inside of your organization. You could say behaviors and attitudes, but your attitudes lead to behaviors, so you could actually minimize it down to behaviors. It's commonly accepted. So if you're trying to preach high performance and you accept mediocrity, your culture is not high performance, it's mediocrity. It dumbs down. If you expect people to be on time and they're not, and you don't address it, then that's your culture. If you talk about your customers like they're idiots or don't get it or whatever, that's your culture, and it'll rapidly assimilate into all of the conversations inside of your company. If you have gossip problems inside of your culture, if you have dysfunction, if your culture is toxic, whose fault is that? Here's what I know. A dysfunctional culture dramatically hampers your success. Man, I've used that word a lot, haven't I? Dramatically or critically? Because it is. You know, what we get good at as business leaders is the technical stuff. I'm going to suggest to you that very, very rarely will you fail or your company fail because you lack technical competency. Typically, the reason you're going to fail is organizationally. It's the leader, it's the strategic plan, leaders, the strategic plans, the go-to-market plans, the sales plans, and it's your sales team and how they're put together in order to work. Now, look, we could jump off and talk about integration and alignment of operations and HR and the other departments all serving the customer and all that. Yeah, that's another big pill to swallow, but too much for a single webinar. Heck, maybe this is too much. It's a lot of material. But these are 9 critical questions that if you really want to go next level, if you really want to resume that upward trajectory in terms of growth, I mean, these are things you're really going to have to look at very carefully. All right, so that's what I have for you today, those 9 questions. And I want to thank you. And I'm actually going to come off the slides now and come back into, and I need to give the sharing away. So let me figure out how to do that. Andy, I'll give it back to you guys. Do that. And I think you should have it back now. And so what we want to do is bring Andy back in and let's field any questions that we might have and think about some responses to those. So what questions do you have, Andy? I'll start with you while we get some guys dialing in some questions. What questions do you have?
Kelly, you really did hit the nail on the head. Now, as a real firefighter, I am somewhat offended with what you said because I do have an MBA, and I don't feel that.
Well, here's the thing, Andy. My son, my youngest, is a paramedic firefighter, so
Okay.
we're almost related, sort of.
Yeah, okay, very good. But no, I think you really hit on a lot of great topics here, a lot for our members to think about. So I just want to check.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that were written with regards to how do you describe your culture. Jeff said family oriented, and that's that's a pretty common response, frankly. And I'd be interested to sort of flesh that out with Jeff. What does that look like? Frank said conservative, and that's a very broad general word. I'm not really sure what that means. I mean, it gives me some impressions, Frank. Mike said path of least in resistance, which is, I mean, that's not uncommon, right? But my point in all of that is culture doesn't have to be what it is if you don't want it to be, Andy. You can create your culture by the cultural tenets that you put in place and ask people and require people to conform to, right? I know that when I was an executive manager in my last job 15 years ago, I had two cultural tenets: professionalism and respect and professionalism. And we talked about it all the time. We treat our customers that way, our coworkers that way, our vendors that way. If you're not respectful of others in the way you treat them, if you're not professional with others, then we're going to have a conversation, because that's the kind of culture that I want to create. Brian has, hey Brian, how are you? We have a question from Brian. It says, how do you pitch your customers on your culture if you believe it's a value driver to your business? How's that for a question? That's a great question. I think that it comes up at some point, Brian. Let me put it this way. There's been a lot of emphasis on your why, right? Simon Sinek, start with why, and your why is, what people buy into. Love Simon Sinek, love to listen to him. Great speaker. He's written great books. And you can skip the book, start with why, and just watch his TED Talk, because it's actually better in my view. But the concepts are amazing. But let me tell you something. If your how stinks, people don't care about your why. How you deliver your product and service, how you follow up and own people's problems and solve issues, and how responsive you are, all of that is driven by your why, yes. But if your why doesn't translate into a superlative how, it's a bit of a problem. So when you're talking to people right out of the chute about who you are, you can mention your culture and that kind of thing, but people aren't really listening until they've begun to buy into you. Unless one of their great drivers in their purchasing decision is that they want to find the right business fit with the right company. But your discovery process should reveal that. And the minute you know that that's a thing, you can say to them, man, I am so glad you mentioned that, because it's incredibly important to our company as well. Let me tell you a little bit about who we are and how we approach. And we try to really create great business fits with our customers. You're the kind of customer we're looking for, all right? But if somebody's just buying product X, I got to build up that trust and that rapport. And at some point in time, I'll insert that and begin to say, let me tell you more about who we are and talk about culture. I think you should. I think it's important. And I think that the reason it's important, Brian, is because your culture should impact your why. It should impact how you deal with customers. And if it does, that means you can explain the why or the reason you do things. And people who understand that, it'll have an impact on, no question. Great question. We still got 5 minutes. All right. So if you have any other questions, love to have those. Let's say make sure I'm not missing anything, Andy. John, thank you very much. I appreciate that. But I want to give anybody an opportunity to ask a question before we leave. Specifically, listen, about those 9 questions. Did they impact you? Did I step on a toe or two, or you're like, hey, we're on track? You never know, Andy, when you're looking at a camera.
Kelly, I would have to say that there is no perfect organization. So the person that watches this presentation and can easily answer those 9 questions is probably a little delusional, in terms of
well, they're killing it.
Those answers being, spot on. I think there's always room for improvement. because our businesses are changing. The environment is changing, especially now. Especially now. This is why this was the perfect time for this presentation.
No doubt. No doubt.
And
We
for our
don't.
leaders, they really do need to look at always, how do I get my organization to the next level? And it could be something as basic as changing culture.
Yes.
Or establishing culture.
And that's where I would leave it, Andy, as we wrap up is, look, I'm not naive, guys. Change is hard. I get it. Change is difficult. It's really hard to bite off on 9 questions. Look, grab one that really struck you, that you went, wow, this is something I need to address. Get one of them, get your team together, and start thinking about putting together a detailed plan to solve that problem. Tackle them one at a time. I mean, I have actually, Andy, worked with companies that their strategic planning document was 50 pages long and they were working on 40 different initiatives. And I'm like, guys, there's no way. It's just not possible.
Sure.
Right? Get focused. That's the way it looks. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. Closing comments, I'll give to you.
All right. Well, Kelly, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about, and that should tide us over until next September, when we'll do our sales conference in 22, and we'll be inviting you back, I'm sure. So I want to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar, and I hope things are good out there. So stay safe. Thank you very much, Kelly, and it's been a pleasure.
Have a great weekend.
Okay, you too.